Shabbat Shalom. In quiet moments at significant times in my life, my mother and I have shared conversations. I remember one when I graduated from college, another when I was ordained a rabbi at the Hebrew Union College, one just before Melissa and I married, and the most recent one occurred when I was installed here as the rabbi at Temple Concord. At each of those moments, my parents acted like every parent. They expressed pride in my accomplishments. They shared words of love and encouragement with me. My father tended to be ever so slightly more emotional, with maybe just the slightest bit of noticeable crack in his voice or a tear in his eye. My mother, though, entered each of those moments with the same phrase. She would simply look at me and say, "Danny, be a mensch." Now, my mother is one of the very few who have ever called me Danny in my whole life, and she might be the only one who still calls me Danny. And even as I say those words, I can hear her saying them in my ear as clearly as I can hear my own voice right now. I also know where she learned that advice. It came from her mother, my grandmother, who preached the same lesson to my mother and to my mother's brothers. And that was the standard in the family. Above all else, be a mensch. Being a mensch may sound like simple advice, but few phrases in English or Yiddish or any other language for that matter require more of a person than that simple thought, be a mensch. Being a mensch, you see, is more than being good, more than being ethical, more than being charitable, more than being righteous. It is all of those attributes and more. To be a mensch is to be fully human, to recognize the humanity in oneself and in others. Being a mensch requires being fully present, fully awake, fully alert. Frankly, being a mensch is rare in our world. Most of us have moments of being a mensch, but few of us are ever a mensch all the time. Our Torah portion this Shabbat Vayera gives two examples of this concept of being a mensch. Both involve Abraham. In one episode, Avraham Avinu, Abraham our patriarch, acts like the quintessential mensch. And in the other, being a mensch seems just about as far from reality as is possible. The first episode is the part that Jesse just read for us from the Torah. There Abraham was, sitting out on the front porch of his tent, sipping a lemonade, recovering from his circumcision. Clearly, this was not his happiest of days, nor his most comfortable of days. But three strangers approach, and instead of just saying hello or ignoring them, as would have been so easy, Abraham doesn't just stand and say hello, he jumps up and runs to greet them. Physically, that must have caused him pain, but it didn't matter, because Abraham's goal was to reach out to those people and welcome them. He brought them into his home. He gave them a glass of lemonade like he'd been enjoying. Maybe it was a mint julep. And he gave them food to eat. He washed their feet. He treated them like human beings. And then they went on their way. Midrash tells us that they were actually angels of God. We don't know who they were. He didn't know who they were. But it didn't stop Abraham from being a mensch, from seeing them as fully human and worthy of all the highest treatment imaginable. And then there's the second episode, which comes a little later in the Torah portion, called the Akeda. It is the story of the binding of Isaac. And in this episode, Abraham exhibits an absolute failure to live fully. God calls Abraham and says, "Abraham, Abraham." And Abraham says, "I'm here." And God says, "Take your son, the one you love, take Isaac, take him to that mountain and sacrifice him there." And unbelievably, Abraham does it. He follows the instructions. He loads up the family station wagon. In this case, it was a few mules. And off the two went with a few servants. They got to the mountain, they left the servants behind, the two of them walked off. They get up to the top of the mountain, they start building the altar. Isaac looks at him and says, "Dad, what are you doing?" Abraham says, "I'm following what I'm supposed to do." Then Abraham ties his son down. And this time, Isaac, our Midrash teaches us, is filled with fear. His eyes are filled with tears. He doesn't know what's going on. And just as Abraham is about to do the unthinkable, an angel emerges, stops him, and a ram is found in the thicket, and we know the story. The ram is sacrificed, the shofar and the ram's horn gets part of its symbolism, and on we go. We read this section at the high holidays, and we read it again now, and the questions are painful and they are daunting. First, which comes first for Abraham, faith or family? Second, how can one be true to God and true to oneself and true to one's fellow human beings at the same time? Is it even possible? Or to put it another way, does Abraham put the institution of faith, the institution of religion, ahead of the lives of his own offspring, ahead of even his own humanity? Why does Abraham fail to be a mensch? This week in our country, I am sad to say, we have witnessed a modern-day Akeda. Just a few hours south of here in State College, Pennsylvania, the accusations grew of child abuse going back years. There was direct witness testimony that they had seen acts taking place. And again and again and again, failure to act, a failure to call someone on it, a failure to stop. Today we see a university where a legendary man is kicked out and his career is sullied. A university community is on the verge of spinning out of control. And the victims who were ignored because, well, the faith of football took precedence over their lives. Now, don't get me wrong. I happen to be a big football fan. I grew up in the state of Nebraska where state religion was, in fact, football. And I've always been an admirer of Joe Paterno and what he's accomplished on the field, even though he's cleaned my team's clock more times than I care to remember. I like the story of who Joe Paterno was, a young poor kid from Brooklyn who finds his way to Brown, an Ivy League institution, graduates, does well, and decides to be a football coach, and does so while preserving intellectual integrity, and until this week, I thought moral integrity as well. But all of that is gone now. All of that is tarnished because when Joe Paterno had to choose between humanity and institution, between being a mensch or not, Joe Paterno failed. I'm also a great believer in universities and the power they possess to make our world better. And among college leaders, Graham Spanier, who was the president of Penn State until this week, was one of the finest. I've known of Graham Spanier for many years. He's not very open about it, but the fact is he is a Jew. And before serving at Penn State, he served at the University of Nebraska. So we had friends in common and there were interactions. Spanier himself has an extraordinary life story. He was born into a German Jewish family, emigrated to this country as a young child. And an episode that occurred in Washington, D.C. defies all logic. There was Spanier in Washington, and it was pouring rain, not unlike earlier today, actually. And people were doubling up in cabs because they wanted to get out of the rain. So Spanier finds himself in the backseat of a cab with another man, and the cabbie and this other man start speaking to each other in German. Spanier is fluent in German, and he starts in, and they start speaking. And he asks the man, "Where are you from?" And the man names a town, and Spanier recognizes it. It's the town he's from in Germany. And he says, "Well, what do you do there?" And he says, "Well, I own a factory." And Spanier says, "Well, what kind of factory is it?" And the man says, "It's a cigar factory." And Spanier stops cold in his tracks, and he's silent the rest of the ride. Spanier's family owned that cigar factory. It was confiscated from them by the Nazis. And here he was in a taxi cab in Washington, D.C., riding with the German man who had taken over that factory. And Spanier handled himself with unbelievable courage. He was a mensch. And yet, when it came to these episodes with children and one of the coaches, Graham Spanier failed. Both he and the coach had an opportunity to be a mensch, to say that humanity trumps all, and they both failed. In our stories in the Torah, our sages have suggested that in both episodes, Abraham was being tested. In the first instance, the test involved his willingness to put others first. Would Abraham put himself out to benefit other people? And in the second, the test was whether Abraham would follow God or not. I don't think Graham Spanier or Joe Paterno were being intentionally tested at all. Rather, they were facing the same daily challenges of being human that we all face. They had to decide on a daily basis whether to favor the institution or themselves or other people. They had to choose whether or not they were going to be a mensch or not. They had to choose whether or not they were going to believe what they were hearing and investigate it and put themselves at risk for being the one tagged with ruining an institution, all to preserve humanity. And when that test came, sadly it appears, both failed. The sadness of the whole episode, from the alleged victims of abuse to one man's turn from being what seemed to be a good man to being a predator, for a legendary coach and a legendary educational leader to find themselves failing publicly, flailingly, to all of the human chaos now going on in that little area called Happy Valley. All of it is overwhelming. But so is the Akeda. There's a reason we wrestle with this story twice a year. It's too hard to grapple with that we can only do it once. We have to come back. What do we do with it? Our Torah teaches us very little. Our Torah doesn't explain why the test occurred, why Abraham followed, what happened to Isaac afterwards, what Sarah said when they came home. Nothing. Our text is silent. Our midrash, the tales that are woven, fill in all sorts of details, but they are only tales. What we know is that ours is a faith and a tradition that calls us to believe in God, but to live like a mensch, to look at one other person, any other person, every other person as the divine, to see the sanctity that each of us carry. The message of the Akeda might be just as simple as be a mensch, be a mensch, be a mensch. I don't know what's going to happen in Penn State, and frankly, what counts now is the lives of those who've been hurt, the children, and the scars they carry. But we as a society have an opportunity after this week. We can look at ourselves and say, how do we live? Do we place institutions above people? Or do we recognize that people must come first? Are we willing to challenge our own faith when it comes to preserving the sanctity of another soul? I believe our tradition says emphatically, with clarity, with purpose, with holiness, the way to live is that three-word phrase that my mother taught me, that her mother taught her. Be a mensch. Be a mensch. Be a mensch. Shabbat Shalom.